Welcome to everyone, those who are connected by Zoom and those who are following us through the YouTube channel for our last appointment of the series of webinars with the title Pedagogy of Communion in the Global Compact on Education, promoted by the master's level course on a culture of unity with the direction of pedagogy and communion for a culture of peace of the Sophia Institute University. I introduce myself. I'm Sarah Feli. I have a degree in sociology at the Sapienza in Rome, and then a master's degree here in Sophia in the culture of unity. I'm working on a doctorate in research right now. The topic of pedagogy of communion are not foreign to my study because for 16 years, it was an everyday relationship with forming children and adolescents in different places in the world. So today I have the pleasure of moderating this seminar around the theme educating community and the development of the child. And we will deal with three experts today: Professor Sylvia Cataldi, and Dr. Mario Yaseboli, who I see are here already present, and I give them a warm welcome here at the Sophia's Center. Welcome. I'll also give you some technical information to be able to help everyone to participate in the best way possible. For those who are connected by Zoom and want to follow in English or Portuguese or Spanish, they can do it by choosing the corresponding translation. It's enough to click on the button for the translation in the lower level in the window of Zoom and choose the desired language. The seminar then will carry on according to what we're accustomed to by now. So the first 3/4 of an hour for 15 minutes each, our speakers will take turns. At the end, we foresee room for dialogue with possible questions which may have arisen during the talks and which little by little can be sent, indicating to whom of the three the question is addressed. And whoever's connected by Zoom can utilize the section set aside for questions and answers, or they can become present by raising their hand with the symbol. In this case, the direction will open up your microphone for your question. Instead, for those who are following by YouTube, they can pose their questions through the chat of the channel. Instead, we will reserve the chat of the Zoom for possible indication of technical problems, which we hope there won't be any. So after this information, we'll enter into our webinar. And I introduce to you the first of our three guests, Mario Yaseboli. He's a psychologist, psychotherapist. He got his doctorate in research in medical science, clinical and experimental at the University of the Studies of Padua. And he got the specialization in psychotherapy with the cognitive psychotherapy at Turin. Currently, he's a professor of psychological elements of development and education here at Sophia University, where he is participating in the School of Postdoctorate. He's also a coordinator of programs of formation in Italy and internationally for educators who work in the framework of childhood and infancy. He collaborates with the editorial group of Città Nuova for projects always in the educational field. I'll give you the microphone, Mario. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and also for the introduction. Also, a greeting to all of those who today are connected, in particular, those who are further away. I greet Chiara and Sylvia, who are present with me today in this space. I would like to use these few minutes that I have available to share a few reflections on the importance of the role of the community in the growth and psychological development of the child. In the presentation of the Global Compact on Education, which was the guideline for this series of webinars, Pope Francis emphasizes the urgency of rebuilding the global educational pact through the realization of what he himself called a great village of education, which is needed to deal with the epochal transformations that we're going through. The great village, which according to the Pope should have the courage to put the person at the center, in our case, the child, for what we're doing today, the courage to invest the best energy in education with creativity and responsibility, and the courage to form people who are available, ready to put themselves at the service of the community. It's an aspect that struck me quite a bit right away. The fact that the invitation was not addressed exclusively to those realities which are directly and formally involved in education, family, school, parish, but it's an invitation that's addressed to all the expressions of civil society, intellectual, scientific, artistic, sports, has very close to the sensitivity of the Pope, but also politics and entrepreneurs. So it's not by chase, the well-known African proverb is recited, to raise a child, an entire village is needed, not just part of it. From the psychological point of view, we can say that the quality of the experiences that the environment offers to the child is determining for his growth. In this sense, the community, we could understand it to be like a place for encounters, a place for looks of relationships, where the child can have the experience of himself and of the other. And at community at the same time, community represents a principal promoting factor in the development of the person in all of his dimensions, the cognitive, affective, social, and as identity. But it's also an important factor for prevention with respect to possible development of problematical trajectories, which oftentimes can become psychopathological. We also need to say that for some time, most of the theories of the authors that influenced research on psychological development in the Western world in particular considered the person separated from his own physical environment, physical, social, and relational environment. And according to these conceptions, which anyways, they have given a determining development to development this discipline, like Piaget, for example, development is above all an individual question. If the environment is limited to have some influence in some way, but it remains an individual question. There were other threads in psychology, like the historical, cultural, like Vygotsky, the Russian, the contextual approaches with Bronfenbrenner, the cultural psychology. And it's these threads which have recognized the context of the community or central role in the development of the person, therefore also the child and the kid. So perhaps among these different theories of ecological systems, perhaps it's the most complete if we want to try to understand this underlying dynamics of the process of development, because it includes in the described context of the author, besides psychological elements, also other elements with which the psychological educational elements that interact, cultural, sociological, anthropological, economic, political, or that entire village that's evoked by the African proverb. And that's why a first question, a first path for reflection that I would like to propose to you is this. In other words, in what way are the relationships, the community, how do they promote the development of the child? We were saying that development doesn't regard only the person, but it involves also the surrounding environment, the entire community, the persons with whom the child interacts. The child is given the potential in itself, it's innate, but it's the context in which it grows and he influences the type of person that he's destined to become. We're saying before this is valid for all of the dimensions, from the cognitive, social, affective, and the identity. For example, we're often led to think of the identity in the sense of itself like a natural gift, something with which we're born, inherited, defined, unchangeable, an entity which in some way exists in itself. Instead, it would make more sense to look at identity like a social fact, like a relational process, as an emerging dimension. To use the words of Maturana, it emerges precisely from the social dynamic and the dominion of the subjectivity generated by the family and a community that the person belongs to. And it's a fruit of the reciprocal recognition with others. In a certain sense, what would constitute our being person would paradoxically be located outside of ourselves, in as much as it's generated. To speak, however, in this context of relationship means referring to a process that goes beyond, that transcends the separation between a person, the child, on one hand, and the society, community on the other. Instead, we have to make the effort to consider in a relationship of complementarity, reciprocity, mutual recognition, either taking the philosophical construct of intersubjectivity, where one acquires a sense of being and meaning for being precisely in relationship with the other. More concretely, to understand this aspects, it's enough to think what happens in the family, within which there is primary relationships, the relationship between the mother and the child, that which is called a process of differentiate of one from the other of themselves. In the first weeks of life, the newborn perceives that he's all one with the mother. He doesn't have a separate idea of himself. Only subsequently does he begin to discover himself as a person and to recognize the mother or the other principal reference as different with respect to himself. Being other from would seem to be the starting point to become who I am myself. And in fostering social development and the development of oneself, the experiences in the community during infancy, during childhood, are fundamental experiences which are mostly effective, which in some way, simplifying quite a bit, they represent the prototype of future relationships because they orient the way in which a child relates with the others in the world. They foster, for example, an attitude of openness, curiosity, trust, availability, or else also an attitude of closure, of threat, of suspicion, of fear towards the world. The role of the so-called figures of reference, central persons, the parents, teachers, coaches, animators themselves, like the places where they learn, the family, school, parish, sports associations, the neighborhood itself that's presented to the child. The referent person in the place where they're educated have a fundamental opportunity, that of impacting strongly on the quality of the experiences that the child undergoes, not only within the walls of the home, but also outside, among the walls, between the walls. And it's a place in which the child can experience himself freely as unique persons, different from, and recognizing the uniqueness of the other. It's in the community that the child can have an authentic experience of reciprocal recognition, or the experience that makes us feel at the same time person and also belonging to something bigger than us. Just try to think, for example, of school, which offers the child the possibility to go beyond the threshold of the home, to widen the confluence of the social, affective, and cognitive experience. It gives the child the chance to discover himself, to reveal himself, to come out, to put himself in play in relation with the others. A place where we adults need to guarantee as much as possible that it's protected, welcoming, that it generates trust. If the community, following the Pope's invitation, is able to recognize itself in its educational role and to become responsible, they prepare their own children for life. In addition, we can say that social development goes with the same pace with effective development. In the psychological framework, and not only, there are many theories and recent studies produced in the effort to understand emotion. Well, this interest in the scientific area has been lively for many years with the growing emotional literacy, which is precisely a concept introduced by Goleman in the famous book of 95, but also a society which is strongly competitive, individualistic, always more oriented to performance. In other words, what am I able to do? And less what's lived, what's felt, the experience that I'm having. Always more oriented to technical development and technology, and less oriented to human relationships. All of this has made it necessary to restore value and room for the emotions in the education of children. If we think of the etymology of the word emotion itself, it's moving out of. It reminds us of a movement that starts from within us and goes towards the others. And in this framework, the emotions can be seen in some way like what's assumed and necessary and prescribed in us to relate with others. First, I was saying there are many theories that they tried to describe this social affective development, but perhaps there's not time to describe them, but it's enough for us to know that emotions can be understood as a relational experience. They represent the first form of communication, the first way of relationship when we come into the world. They are a characteristic, a human characteristic, natural, innate, fundamental. They are also a door for access to the interior world, personal world, besides a door to the external world. But a second question, a second reflection I share with you then, in which way does the community enter into play in the relationship with the child that experiences in the community in the affective development? According to an interesting author, Stephen Gordon, around 89, within the socio-constructionist perspective and sociological perspective, is among the first to emphasize the role that he called emotional culture, in which children are precociously exposed, and proposes the construct of a emotional competence understood as a together group of knowledge and abilities of behavior. In particular, according to Garden, the acquisition of this emotional culture would be the prerequisite to be emotionally competent. Maybe the idea is a concept the child forms with regard to emotions that are connected to what's believed, the lexicon, the educational experiences that the adult proposes to them. The children build some personal ideas regarding emotions, regarding their meaning, the range of acceptable expressions, the context in which it's allowed to be expressed, and the ways in which they should or should not be expressed, precisely on the basis of the emotional culture in which they grow up. Later, Carolyn Sani wrote around 2000, widened this construct of emotional competence that Gordon had brought out. She brings out even more the relational aspects. According to this author, in fact, the components of the emotional competence would be those abilities that are necessary to live what she calls social transitions, being interpersonal exchanges, in other words, relationship, the place in which this meaning itself is established. And Sarni identifies some basic abilities comprising this emotional competence. I'm going to list 8, and we'll see very quickly listing them, but they are those competences which are promoted by the educational programs and affection and emotions which are beginning to be multiplied in the educational realities in schools, families involving various persons. The first is being aware of one's own emotions, the capacity to distinguish and understand the emotion of others, possessing an adequate emotional vocabulary which makes it possible to recognize, to give a name, to elaborate and share one's own emotions. The empathetic involvement, the capacity to separate one's own emotional experiences from the expressive behavior, or else the capacity to recognize that our emotions and our way of expressing them can have an effect on others. Garni then talks about the capacity to deal with one's own emotions, which have a negative dimension, through that strategy which is called self-regulation. So just as she recognized that the quality of relationships is directly connected to the emotional experiences experienced from within. And the last one, but not the least, Sandra talks about emotional auto self-effectiveness, acceptance of one's own emotional life, of one's own emotional experiences, which has 2 impacts, which are both important. The first regards the knowledge of oneself, and the second, which regards the availability, in a certain sense, to look inside within. And at the end, you're saying, luckily, in the last years, this awareness has grown regarding the importance of the affective dimension in the educational environment. There are more and more programs involving the family, the school, sometimes also other frameworks of life for the children. In this sense, we would need to involve the community more. There are programs that are put together with the goal of promoting a greater emotional competence. but also to be in contrast with a certain idea of education, which is based principally in many places in the world on the transmission of intellectual competence or tools linked with knowing how to do things. But still quoting Pope Francis, education goes through the harmony of the head, hands, and heart. So it's not just precisely intellectual competence or not just tools of knowing how to do, but also what one feels, also with the affective dimension. So I'd like to conclude this first talk, this introduction, with the words, with Korsa's words. He's a Polish doctor, because precisely beyond the many words that filled these few words, that filled this, Korsak is the name of the person. The emotional aspect means the art and poetry express this. Korsak writes this: say, you say, it's an effort to deal with children. You are right. Then you add, because it's necessary to put ourselves at their level, lower ourselves, curve down, make ourselves small. There you are wrong. This is not what tires us the most. It's rather the fact of being obliged to rise up to the height of their sentiments, to stretch ourselves, get on our tips of our toes to not wound them. So Sarah, thank you everyone for listening. I give the microphone back to you. I hope I was on time and I didn't go too fast for the translations, and that this contribution in some way was useful for building together this room for some dialogue. Certainly, thank you. Thank you, Mario. With this last word, so poetic, I was almost moved because the experience continues in front of children of being on our tiptoes for this purity that reminds us, they remind us of, and we can, if we take it into consideration, we can approach them. So thank you for being on time. Now I'm going to give the word to our second speaker, Chiara Spatola, who is a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, a doctor of research in psychopathology of development, a teacher at the Faculty of Psychology at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan, and here at Sofia University. She carries on an activity of research in clinical psychology and psychology of development. Now the microphone to you, Chiara. Good, thank you. I too greet everyone, those who are following us, and the participants. I thank Mario for this first part. Very interesting. They already gave us a lot of basis for reflection. So I'll share my screen with you for a moment. Excuse me. Oh, it was already, here it is. I made. And this afternoon, let's say, I would like to pick up again what Mario already said regarding the very important role of the community and plays in the development of the child. And this, let's say, I would like to emphasize in particular the prospect of psychopathology of development. In as much as, let's say, the disturbance that can come, the deviation, the typical trajectory, they are intrinsically connected. It's not to think, you think you've already shared your screen. No. Excuse me. I start again with the sharing. Now you can see it? So I was saying, I would like to start with you with these first two questions. In what way is the educational context can function as a protective factor with respect to the rising of psychological and psychiatric problems in the child. And so it refers not just to more formal context, but also all the informal ones, like Mario already emphasized, those which can appear to be marginal. They risk running the risk of appearing marginal, but they're not there. All that network of experiences with which the child comes in contact during the development. The second question instead is, what is the role of the educating community when a psychopathological element is already present? When, for example, the child manifests behavior which are problematical, dysfunctional, which are like anxiety or timidity, or else externalizing, like, for example, aggressive behavior. So I like to start from a perspective, which that is quantitative genetics, also because in what I studied the first part of my time of my research, quantitative genetics has the objective of looking at thousands of families, especially twins, and to look at the role of genes in the environment and forming what the differences, individual differences are. In particular, it concentrated on that of the psychopathology. So trying to understand the causes of psychopathology. What emerged clearly is our predisposition that's innate is important. It has a role, surely, above all in some kinds of psychopathology, but it's fundamental also that of the environment. The thing that is surprising is that this role of the environment is not preponderant. The family is not preponderant. Really, it's broad and it's aspects which are not shared by the same members of the family. For example, all those environment aspects of the child lives in a community. And that's why there is a real constant interaction between the children and the environment. They're not two separate things that one on top of the other, but they're constantly interacting with one another. They influence each other in orienting the trajectory of development towards development or towards psychopathology. The context in which we live, therefore precisely this entire network of relationships, in fact, forms our brain. The brain, we discover more and more, little by little, as the neuroscientists go ahead, is a very plastic organ. It's all lifelong, it continues to create synapses, connections. An effect of experimenting positive contexts that are nourishing works in such a way that the brain can really function fully to its potential. So it can develop its innate potential fully. Therefore, with you, let's say I wanted in particular question, the educational community, how can it build in the environmental contexts that are really nourishing, that they make the child flourish? In other words, they make it possible to find a terrain that welcomes him, to reach growth harmonious growth as much as possible. So the first is harmonization. The second is contact with the interior dimension. And the third is the building of the educating community, building of networks of resilience. Now we're going to see them in detail. So regarding the harmonization of affection, I like to start from the work of a psychologist, Daniel Stern. He emphasizes that the harmonization of affection starts from the relationship between the child and the mother. When the mother is able to understand the affective state of the child and to be in harmony with that, with his communication on the basis of what she understood and felt and felt, then comes about this precious thing, which is the harmonization of affection. This builds the basis for the development of the intersubjective dimension, that is our capacity to be with the other. And it's a very important dimension, which then constitutes the basis for emotional competence, the self-capacity, effective self-capacity that Nadia talks about. So the development of a healthy development in relationship with the other starts from these three exchanges: mother-child, but I would say not just the mother-child, but also the role of the father is very important. and also with one's own brothers, sisters, grandparents. So it's also important to widen, to broaden it right from the beginning in these first moments, to open up our look, not just to the mother, but to that's what's most studied and so on, but also to other roles. So the interior harmonization is a process that we could explain as three stages. The first stage is attention. In other words, additional attention, which makes it possible for the mother, the child, or at least the parents, the educator, and the child to be in harmony. That is, to bring their attention to something that's shared. The second stage is that of recognition, in which precisely the state of the other is recognized, and the third is harmony, which in the end we make it resound in ourselves, the sentiment, the affection, the emotions of the other person. And therefore, we make ourselves a home, a house for resonance of what the other is experiencing in the present moment. This is also important because the harmonization is not a process that comes once for everyone, but it's constantly renewed in the present moment. Through this process, the child reaches the awareness that what it feels has meaning, what he feels has value. These studies on the harmonization were further enriched by the contribution of neurosciences. In this regard, Alan Shore emphasizes the aspect of relationship between affection, brain, and development. And he explains how harmonizing with the mind of other persons, the child has the possibility to mature. In other words, the possibility that reaches a maturation where the cerebral circuits have a better capacity to self-regulation. It's very important. That is the capacity there where there's a very intense emotion which runs the risk of being translated into impulsive behavior. The child instead is able to regulate himself. In other words, to stop, to recover, to control on the level of its behavior. As I was saying earlier, this process is not peculiar to the relationship between mother and child. So it's important for us to widen our outlook to all the contexts in which this harmonization can come about. It can come about at school. It can come about during a game in which the child deals with an emotional difficulty, and therefore in various situations. In fact, for the entire course of our life, we experience relationships which are gratifying when we perceive the recognition of our own state of affection. In other words, when we feel that the others are able to recognize what we are experiencing. And as I was saying at the beginning, it's important the protective role of this harmonization, what it can have with respect to the development of trajectories which diverge from the typical development. Indeed, in particular cases, the capacity of an educator to be in harmony with the child can even repair the trauma, relational trauma, and the wounds that have come about in the past in the child. And this really emerges also from the clinical experience. The interior life of the child, if it comes to be perceived beyond what is his behavior, which can also be dysfunctional because we've moved from the field of psychopathology. So a child who has a dysfunctional behavior, if he sees himself in his own interior dimension, his own uniqueness, precisely beyond what he does in his action, then he has a possibility for some repair. This possibility of recognizing oneself. So I asked myself together with you, how can we educators facilitate this process? How can we help the child to be in harmony? In other words, to activate this reciprocal recognition. First of all, opening our channels, sensorial and emotional channels, not just our five senses, but also our capacity to perceive the emotions, our or in a mirror, leaving behind all the rest, in other words, judgments, ideas, perhaps our intention of transmitting and teaching something in that moment. Being able, when we see there's a difficult emotion, to leave all the rest in the background and to be there fully with the child, with all of our dimensions. This is not easy. It's something which is easier to say than to do, because the moment in which the child presents problematical behavior, there can be an emotional impact which is very strong on the educator, both whether it happens in a family or at school, or even if it happens in other contexts in which the community finds itself. Therefore, it's important that the educator recognizes his own emotions, recognize this impact, that it can also put him in difficulty, and therefore, so he can accept this and have a mind which is open and receptive. In terms, I like very much the roominess, receptive roominess of the lover. The second aspect that I was just mentioning at the beginning is instead contact with the interior dimension. It's an aspect which is really important. It's fundamentally important, and it's very much connected with the harmony that we talked about earlier. Daniel Siegel talks about Mindsight. Mindsight means seeing of the mind, the capacity to see one's own thoughts, one's own emotions, the impulses, to recognize the physical impulses. This capacity, according to Daniel Siegel, is fundamental. In fact, the children, adolescents today are exposed to a high number of flow of information. They have contact every day, at least sometimes constantly, with technology, social media, and the internet. This, if on one hand, it's a resource, because we saw in the pandemic that technology made it possible for us to connect, to communicate. But on the other hand, there's a risk, which leads to neglecting the interior dimension, because all the empty space are, you could say, occupied by technology. So the utilization of these tools. And at this point, no longer having this empty space of connection with one's own interior world, they're not trained, formed these cerebral circuits of Mindsight. Daniel Siegel emphasizes how the time for interior dimension favors certain development of the brain. In other words, our brain is connected, but this cerebral interaction can be favored by some experiences. And contact with the interior dimension is one of these experiences, in as much as it facilitates the development of integrative fibers in the frontal cortex, which is very important for a whole group of functions. And it harmonizes also the activity of the two hemispheres. The right hemisphere, which is a more emotional, and the left hemisphere, which is a more logical and rational hemisphere. So the child, if he's adequately sustained, supported, he can learn little by little, gradually, to recognize the various aspects of himself and his own experience. Clearly, this could be done in different way depending on the stage of development. So it won't be the same for a child or an adolescent, clearly. However, in all of the stages of development, this capacity of looking inside has an important role, because it interrupts what the impulsive reactions, which are often the cause of aggressive behavior. And therefore, it makes it possible to create some room for reflection about emotions and actions. The child in that space, room, can decide what's important for me. What do I want to do in this moment? So, harmonizing, in other words, the fact of developing, the development of Mindsight passes through some specific aspects, which I will quickly list. The first is giving a name to one's own emotion. Therefore, being able to define with the name the child finds. Recognizing thoughts and impulses, in other words, seeing them, however, without being overwhelmed by them. Learning to be calmed down through strategies like, for example, focusing on breathing, as, for example, mindfulness does. Understanding the effect that one's own behavior has on other persons. So you see the basis for empathy also. And reflecting on who wants to be, who one wants to be, and what one desires really in one's own life. The child can enter into contact with one's own dimension of values. If we help him already, when he's very small, the child is able to do this. He's capable of stopping and reflecting. What type of person do I want to be? What do I want to do with my life? And therefore, as I was saying, it's a capacity to look at one's own interior dimension that's closely connected with empathy. There are two capacities that reflect one another. They reinforce one another reciprocally. And therefore, it's important, again, thinking of child with their own difficulties, to not replace them in the moral choices. So, for example, at many times, there's a first impulse, say, do this. Listen, it'd be better to do it this way. Maybe an erroneous behavior that the child continues with. But it's important instead that the child has room for reflection, that he can elaborate himself to repair the problems, or repair some mistaken gesture that he did. In this way, we reinforce his capacity to develop empathy. In this way, we are investing not only on concluding, resolving the question, but also with helping him for his future. That is the capacity that child has to develop empathy and pro-social dimension. So we need to build together, in other words, co-construct with children these dimensions, which Mario said, respecting the specificity of the children, but also giving value to the empathetic capacity and the behavior. In the end, the last aspect is the building of networks of resilience. Resilience is the capacity to deal with mourning or stressful experiences. And we're in the middle of a stressful circumstances. Precisely in this occasion, like in many others, when the human being finds himself in front of the impact of something that's difficult or painful, it's important to count on one's own connection with one another, because we are stronger, more resilient if we are connected among us. And this is shown to us from experience and also from scientific research. Therefore, the educating community, I think, has to be, before anything else, aware of its own role, the importance, enormous importance that this educational role has. And you have to find room to check against the question, to reflect on itself. Also, in taking the contribution of educators that have different roles, different things to offer. But they have the courage also to learn from our mistakes of the past. So to not dwell on this, get stuck in certain strategies only because we already utilized them. So to be very flexible. Flexibility is really an important thing, very important thing for an educator. In the end, dialogue, harmonizing the differences, giving value to the differences between different types of participant, or a more academic approach, or approaches is more based on direct experience, but create room like this for dialogue between the academy and life. And in the end, that this educating community should be able to take a risk, because it takes upon itself to put oneself in play with all the dimensions of the person: cognitive, emotional, corporal, bodily. In other words, to not put in some way any kind of barrier between us and the child, between us and the community. So to conclude, I'd like I myself also utilize art in the sense that I like very much to imagine this education community as a mosaic in which every little tile, even if it's small, is very important. But above all, where it's precisely the harmony of these tiles that builds then the beauty. Therefore, this is a bit the message, the final message that the reflection I wanted to share with you and how I think the community, educating community should be. Thank you for your listening. I hope I didn't go too fast for the translators. Thank you, Professor Chiara. Thank you for your contribution. Really also very rich with concrete stimuli for educators, but for adults in general, when we approach children, facilitate also, at least to not impede their flourishing. So thank you, really. And we want to remind everyone that you can arrive in the chat for YouTube and the Zoom the questions, which then will be put in a second moment, posed in a second moment. Where it is now, I introduce the last of our three guests today, Professor Sylvia Cataldi, who with her talk, she will comment on what we just heard as a quality of a discussant to the webinar. Sylvia Cataldi teaches sociology at Sapienza University in Rome. She works with the methodology of social research, and among her topics, there are regimes of our mental dimension of social. She coordinates international research on social one, and she shares responsibility for dialogue with the culture of the Focolare movement. So Sylvia, the microphone is yours. Thanks very much. And thanks. First of all, I'm very happy the discovery of another sociologist that's here that's present. And it was moderating, so I'm happy also to have this chance for an exchange. And I thank very much Mario and Yara, who came before me. They gave me a lot of provocative thoughts. First of all, one of the characteristics also as a teacher, as a researcher, is the awareness of one's own limitations. And therefore, it's always interesting, let's say, to understand precisely the psychological point of view. I'm a sociologist, and so I raise some questions. I'm a mother, so I raise some questions on everything. Let's say it's working, not working, to be in harmony again. Also with my daughters, and not just. So it's very interesting. Let's say one thing struck me very much. That is the topic of educating community. We'd say it's offered to us by Pope Francis in the Global Compact on Education, which in reality, I would also like to implement again from this standpoint, because in reality, there are also documents, international documents that exist, like in the international politics, like the Agenda of 2030, Sustainable Development, which precisely with at the center of the commitment, that of liquidity, opportunity, and educational learning. So this concept of the educating community, which is contained in the Global Compact on Education, is in reality something precisely which can belong precisely to as a guideline, also on the international level. And I would like it precisely on international politics. As a sociologist, clearly my questions are more related to not only it's not the educating community exists. We're saying very well, Yara Spatula and Mario Yaseboli, they were saying it has to have its responsibility, also awareness of the responsibility it has. However, on the other hand, the opposite effect exists as well. Thanks precisely to the educational role, and through an integral education, the community is built up. So as to say, the effect is always twofold. It's not just, let's say, education towards the child, but also precisely this constitutes the community itself. And this, in my opinion, is the most interesting thing. From this standpoint, I would like to speak about 3 points that seem to me important. And then afterwards, one thing which I always had close to my heart, and it awakened the Gatta's and Mario's talks, evoked me again, and we heard them earlier in a couple of encounters. So we had a chance also to discuss some things on these topics. The first point regards, let's say, a very strong aspect, which is contained in the Global Compact on Education, which, however, in my opinion, is fundamental for us as well. That is to have a strong act from the cognitive standpoint, epistemic, that is to take on a specific point of view, to assume one, the point of view of the last ones, the little ones. And this, let's say, is required of us surely during our everyday actions of education, but also as scholars. And it's an act, let's say, that's pretty strong because it rejects, in fact, neutrality. And concretely, what does this mean? It means, certainly starting from the periphery, from the last, but also putting some topics at the center, like that particular gender. In other words, also education of children, girls and children. And this is one of the aspects, or let's say talking about putting at the center disability, the various forms, psychopathology that Gatta talked about. That is to put ourselves in this perspective. This is fundamentally important for all of us educators, but also for the entire community, because precisely what does it mean, let's say, an educating community? It's not just taking the responsibility for these people, but also knowing that this has an effect of building a community if we put ourselves in this standpoint, and almost practically revolutionary. The other thing, another point that seems very important to me, and what we talk in this webinar, regards the issue of emotions in the social, emotional. And the Global Compact in Education, there's an expression that I like very much in which it said, education is a question, first of all, of love. And this always struck me from the moment which it was launched, because I also had the luck of being present during the launch of the Global Compact in Education on last October 15th. I was struck because love precisely is multidimensional. Before anything else, let's say, certainly it starts from the heart. It starts from the heart, but we need to be aware that at least in our Western society, emotions were put aside from a public standpoint, from a social standpoint, from a political standpoint. And very often considered, not by chance, the question of, let's say, of the feminine, I don't know how this is translated. I'm grateful to the translators for the effort they're making. It's a question of the feminine dimension. We know that, for example, the founders of the Focolare movement, Chiara Lubick, at the beginning, let's say, was also accused of sentimentalism because they were saying precisely you need to love. And love wasn't something that mattered with religion before. It wasn't a serious thing, loving. Sentimentalism. But in reality, sentiment is fundamentally important. It's fundamentally important in women and men, all human beings. But above all, it's fundamentally important because, let's say, this moves the minds and also actions. So if we don't start, let's say, from love, we don't have a vision which is integral of the person and also of the education itself. But love is also has a eminently practical dimension. We were saying it very well. The sociologist, French sociologist, Bourdieu, he was talking about the influence, practical influence of love. It requires the heart, it requires the mind, but also the hands, very concretely, because it requires taking care of people. And therefore also, so in the Global Compact on Education, instead, also the term itself, culture, in reality, in its etymological meaning, coming from Latin, in reality, it means taken care of. It requires time and room, space, and everyday care. Therefore, precisely for this, in my opinion, it's fundamentally important to put at the center of the question the issue of education as an act of love, which transforms the world, because before anything else, it transforms ourselves. In other words, we're all subjects included in the relationship. And then the suggestion also of Mario and Caro is very important in this regard. We're talking particularly about resilience of the communities, of resilience. There are some very interesting studies. Some have been quoted by Chiara. I've known some others, the kind of neuroscience in which love is a factor that has an impact on with regard to the individual, what Chiara was saying. So with regard to children, but also with regard to adults, it has an impact with regard to depression, which is the greatest sickness of the West. I know that we're connected in various places in the world. Precisely, this could seem to be a problem, let's say, of consumerism, and it is in part. But this also we need to take this into account. But it's also a protective factor with regard to the entire community. It's very important, this question of the community, because precisely love, and so the pro-social dimension, the action of the kind, loving, social love, public love, constitutes communities. And this we've seen precisely during the pandemic, how fundamentally important the protective factors were. We saw in the condominiums in the cities and the communities, wherever, let's say, it was put in motion. The third point that I wanted to, for a moment, regards in particular relationship with the otherness, with who is different, which was mentioned also by Mario and Chiara. We're talking, for example, of dialogue. Chiara was saying towards the end. And it is very important because education precisely is the encounter with the other, but the other who is different. That process, psychological process of detachment from the mother that Mario was talking about is fundamental because it builds the identity of each one of us. And it has repercussions also within society. There are sociologists, for example, actually one of the third generation of this Frankfurt School, who talk precisely about the new social connection there can be within our pluralistic society, precisely starting from that root, which is recognition, first of all, of the difference of the other, which starts out with the mother and the child, which is the first actor, the first person with whom we find ourselves in front of. At the beginning, there's a symbiotic relationship. I won't explain now, I wouldn't be able to, except from personal experience, like with daughter and mother. However, surely, this is the basis also for our society. Maybe we don't recognize this enough. And therefore, recognition of the other, the difference, is the fundamental element, above all, for the society today, precisely are pluralistic. A sociologist, instead of French sociologist, for example, his name is Alain Caillet, tells us that something has changed. Well, Francis as well talks about fraternity, but it's not the fraternity of before. This fraternity, says, is a pluralistic fraternity. First, a fraternity existed earlier, but it was with others who are similar within one's own class, within one's own nation, perhaps just male. Skew if I'm always talking about the issue of gender, but let's say it's the first difference that we come into contact with. So, and instead, the fraternity, the social connection that we need today, above all, on a global level, is precisely that which recognizes diversity. And it constitutes also a universal dimension, which is pluralistic. The researchers talk about pluralversality instead of universality, which is the one word one, unique, similar. Instead, it has to be plural. And this was, let's say, is very important in our communities, in our small dimension, in our family, in our schools, and so on, but also in the nations and on the level of global relationships. The last point, instead, that is very close to my heart, regards the protagonism of the children, their role. This seems very, very important to me. It was good, very well mentioned by Mario, which I talked about this. We need, however, to clarify something. First of all, the children as a social category, political category, they haven't always existed. It's an invention of modernity. Perhaps we don't have this where it's a question of youth. Biologically, they always existed, but as a category of recognition, both of their rights and the protection of children, but also precisely as a specific category, it's very recent. In that of adolescence, I know that among you, there is someone who works with adolescents, or they have adolescent children like I do. It's even more recent. At least in the West, it goes back at least to the 70s and 80s. And it had undoubtedly very positive effects, dealing with violence with regard to children, recognition of the rights of childhood, and so on. However, it also had some undesirable aspects from the social standpoint. For example, in some contexts, there is still an evolutionary outlook. The child exists with its rights to be protected. However, in the common language, for example, we talk about minors. Minors, just the word in itself means something who then become an adult. Maybe it's not well understood. Language is important because it indicates something which is in evolution. We need to look at them in that moment. He or she exists in that moment, like we too change, constantly are changing as adults. Then another possibility instead that developed pathology and developed above all in our context regards instead adultism. In other words, kids live a bit like adults. They dress like adults. They have a precocious sexuality and so on. This is another effect, let's say, of this invention. Also because above all regarding adolescence, because the discovery in quotation marks of adolescence is very much connected with the logic of the market. And so we need to be aware of this. Another aspect, however, and it's that Mario Yaseboli was talking about, regards instead the fact that perhaps we don't consider them, now in spite of everything, don't consider children as an essential part of our society. And it's fundamentally important to be protected and so on. But we have in reality a kind of segregation, let's say, of children and kids. What does this mean? It means that in fact, inside of our mind, we think we need to work regarding, this is more regarding the West. In Africa, I think it's different. We need to relearn, evidently, from other contexts. Let's say instead, children are in the hands of specialized agencies. What are these agencies? Purely the family, but also educational systems, agencies of socialization like the school, precisely, like the parish, or new ones like the media and social media. And this is particularly important because this is an effect that's perverse in the invention of the way of dealing, let's say, with the category, in quotation marks, social, political, of childhood and adolescence, because in fact, it led to a loss of interest from a political, social standpoint towards children, from those who don't worry about it, don't deal with it. It's just to say it's your responsibility, yours because you're a parent, yours because you're a school, and so on. Instead, let's say we're dealing with rethinking the child as an actor, a social actor, like a citizen, active, that is a subject, who's a protagonist. So there cannot be agencies that take care of them. We're saying precisely that educating community is not just to have some responsibilities, but recognize this active role in such a way that the community itself constitutes itself differently. I'll give you some examples. First of all, on the scientific research level, academic level, and I say this because on a scientific level, precisely these seminars are a prelude to some formation courses which are being launched. And we'll conclude with this. We have here Professor Milan, who will talk to us about this. Well, precisely from the scientific standpoint, but all the disciplines work with children and boys and girls. It's if to say only some areas can worry about it. It's not a generalized interest. Also from the disciplinary standpoint, yes, there's education, psychology. There's some who work on others, not so much, and so on. I, who am a sociologist, or studying even politics, they oftentimes don't deal with children. It's something which isn't appropriate in the disciplinary standpoint. Yes, because they are actors, they are protagonists, they are citizens. The other thing is surely reviewing not only the declarations of rights of children and boys and girls, also with the responsibilities. Let's say with the duties that they have themselves with respect to other children, with other adolescents, with regard to the community itself. This is also a responsibilization that's important. Or else, other proposals are those of creating some organs. They exist in some places, but probably there's a greater need for them to be more widespread from the political standpoint. In some towns, they exist consultational organs for children in such a way they're consulted for important issues. Well, these are just some ideas. However, let's say that they may come to mind how not always we have this awareness and readiness to what does it mean really to take global compact and education seriously, really to take seriously the fact that the educating community is constituted as a community starting precisely from the specific role of each one. And therefore, on this, I wanted to thank you above all for the points that are very stimulating. So what I'm offering you is just a little bit of provocative statements. Thank you, Professor, which is so rich that you showed us how fruitful the dialogue among disciplines, especially between sociology and education, and how many things, both one and the other, we can be enriched. Now, since we are a little bit beyond the time, I'll go give the word to Irene, who will tell us some of the questions that during the talks have come out. So good evening to everyone. I'm going to read 3 questions to you that are addressed in general to all 3 of our speakers. The first, how to exercise a behavior which is against fragility. The second, from Marcel from Argentina, and she asks, what could the consequences be for the social development and emotional development of our young people and our children after 2 years of isolation because of the pandemic, and therefore not being able to interact with other children or adults outside of the family circle? And the third question is, what is unity in education, emotional education? How to avoid schizophrenia, emotional and schizophrenia without unity? So they were not addressed to any particular person. I don't know if you want to choose, each of you, one, or whoever wants to begin to speak, perhaps Mario, who began first, I don't know. If you want, in particular, the second question I found stimulating because I live it also as a psychotherapist, my clinical experience, in other words, that of the effect of the pandemic in this isolation. Unfortunately, we have to say that these effects are there. We see them, and they're also very important. And that's why, really, as an educating community, it's important that we question ourselves about this. What are the effects, but above all, how can we contain them or take advantage of them or understand them? So surely, one of the things that I noticed is that this isolation led to, above all, in the most fragile children, which they may have already, the network may have already been breaking around them. Above all, this isolation that led the school, for example, to be missing in their everyday life, did in such a way that what developed was a sense for them to close in their own room, to enter more and more into greater contact with technology. That's something which already begun, but this moment, this development made exacerbated. The involvement of the corporal dimension of the body, or the emotional dimension in the relationship, was missing. And so really it's important, clearly, there's not one way, a recipe that enables us to overcome this, but really the key could be that of cohesion, that is striving, is offer more and more context to listen to the discomfort, to be very receptive, and therefore more than going with judgment, to go with the listening to these children, to ask them how did they live this period, questioning how do they feel now, that they're beginning perhaps starting over again. If, for example, the adolescents, the kids with social anxiety, who perhaps were able to control it, they were able to manage it, now it's a big effort now. Because after the isolation, you have to get used to it again, the fear of being judged, the fear of the other, the difficulty of contact with the group. So it's very important question, surely, that I think, surely I didn't give an answer, exhaustive answer, but it's a topic that we need to deal with as from the standpoint of unity, undoubtedly. Gotta just allow me to add one aspect, in the sense that I'm a father of two very small children, but you as well, Kat, I know that you have three. It's this question I've posed, first of all, as a father, as with my wife and as parents, because effectively from one day to the other with COVID, the children found themselves, their routine was just completely changed, also the family routine. But from their standpoint, it meant something important, because from one day to the other, they weren't able to see their grandparents, their cousins, or uncles and aunts, and oftentimes families here in Italy with one child. So with only children, so this is even more emphasized, this social isolation, this possibility of relationship with peers. And in the same way, the organizational routine of the family was blown up. So this also had a very strong impact. At a certain point from the political choices, at least it's my impression here in Italy, besides closing the schools, not much else was done. In the sense that it was, Sylvia was saying, what is the role that the society plays in the children? How do we see them? Are they at the center? Pope Francis was saying to us, we have to have the courage to put people at the center. Do we have the courage to put children at the center? Also, from the political standpoint, from the point of view of choices, the closure increased this inequality. Teaching from a distance through the tools that are available, and who wouldn't have this possibility, or who allows to have wide open space in their home, or who instead, like us, lived in a house with 70 square meters, if even less room. So it certainly wasn't easy, the impact on them. But as we were saying earlier, and also gotta emphasize, opening up room for development so that children can explore what's happening. This is valid for all the moments, in particular, moments of a passage. And perhaps in experience, and we're trying also to respond to another of the questions. How do we exit? How should we behave that's against fragility? I think the first thing is welcoming, in a certain sense, of this fragility. And the Pope was saying the children who need more love are those who demonstrate behavior which is not lovable. That is to create room where there's not judgment, but welcome, the capacity to welcome both as family, as school. So all of that network of resilience that Chiara was saying we need to cultivate. I think that it's fundamentally important also in this. There's that responsibility and that need to recognize one another as at communities that are educational, not just single agencies. The school thinks that, the family is taking care of that, or the parish will take care of that. But to look at the children all together, probably to put at the center, the child at the center, is a great question. What is the position of the child in the community? However, we adults need to see our position. Are we available, ready to do this, to put ourselves not at the center any longer, to have children at the center? And another question came. I don't know if Irene. If you wanted to add something, I just said, if there was one, certainly we saw for Chiara, and a specific one, and the brain. Yeah, I read it in the chat. How to children relationship between affection, brain, and development. That was I was mentioning in my presentation. So surely the way through the relationship, in other words, if we are in harmony with the child, and we try to stimulate this mechanism, this reciprocal process. In other words, I put myself in harmony with you, that you may have a difficult emotion, but also I stimulate you, I invite you to be in harmony with me, with the other, with your companion. So to be able to create this reciprocity, and this does in such a way that in the brain, what's activated is not just those circuits that's mirrored, been very studied. I don't know, there are many areas of our brain that have the role of this empathetic process. And the more we train ourselves in our everyday life, the more these connections are reinforced. Therefore, when we're small children, like they were being taught autonomy, for example, it's important that we teach them, but we learn together with them because really we build together. Not that we give them lessons of empathy, but we live with them, empathy, to learn it together. In fact, it's useful. They put themselves in a position of learning together with you, to be in harmony with you, to calm myself down, to carry on this function of empathy. So there's still another question. So I'll read the last question. It's addressed a bit to the teachers at Sophia, and to ask, what are the examples of emotional education affection at Sophia? Could you tell us 3 principal results of emotional education seen in these 13 years? There are many other professors in chat connected by Zoom. There's Pepe Milan, Julie, Antonella de Ponte. And I tried to begin myself, and then if my colleagues want to add something, very good. I'll begin in the sense that I'm at Sophia. I teach psychology for more than 10 years, so for very early in Sophia's history. It's not that there is an explicit formation in emotional intelligence. The educational project of Sophia is a formation 360 degrees between life and study. And therefore, the results should be, the ex-students should share this. because it's not that we have, in a moment, we did a study, a precise study, even if the idea came to us many times, it's not said that we're not able to articulate it on what benefits, what results it can bring, precisely attention that we try to have, surely for the relational dimension between the students, but also between teacher and student, between teacher and teacher, the entire staff, and so on. All of this deals with the relational competence and also emotional intelligence. We are aware, we also have proposed some extracurricular activities that aim precisely at going in depth in some particular aspects, precisely our functioning, in relationship, and thinking not just of the courses of mindfulness that we've taken advantage of also with many of the little city of Lopiano, in an environment which is even more stimulating, but I'm also thinking of seminars on managing conflict, nonviolence that we've had with Professor Calabo in these last years. This is just as in terms of activities, which are more specific. And then I would say that perhaps the experience of Sophia goes beyond the aspect of emotional education, precisely because it puts itself, it aims very high at something which is precisely development of a point of view, a perspective on the world, which is really comes out from relationships among the thinking minds, but also among persons who concretely then share the experience. This is what I would say. I mean, there's much more to say, but I don't want to go on this much. Of course, there's a lot to say, really, and you said quite a bit already, Antonella. I believe that the experience of Sophia is the experience of narrativity, everyday narrative dimension, which comes out in the education, but it comes out in the hallways, and it's revealed also along the road. It's the experience of this relational dimension, precisely. And that which perhaps we can grasp at distance of years, and many who have gone through this dimension of synergy, educational synergy, but not only that, it's precisely the awareness that we see in many when we too put ourselves in a position of dialogue and listening. The awareness that of having become at least a bit more actors for encounter, actors for dialogue, and therefore actors of listening, agents of empathy, actors of active participation, which is demanding. So through this participation in the relational circuits, which are in a communitarian dimension, we acquire not only the theoretical content, which is very important, obviously, and which also help, as we were saying earlier, but we acquire this lens. At times it may be imperceptible, competence to be persons who have the antennae that are able to understand the other, understand different languages, understand also that which may not be expressed, which may be hidden, grasp that clandestine, hidden dimension that's in each of us, also in context, to become persons who are interpreters, readers, interpreters of the reality that's being lived. Readers, interpreters, and then actors, interpreters. In other words, that which evidently cannot be measured in the traditional sense of the term, but which can easily grasp in many, is precisely this dimension of a narrative dimension, which little by little we become competent because Sophia tries to be set up this way. It's an effort, it's an attempt, but it's an attempt which brings some results. Many students during the course, at the end of the course, say to me, but I know they say it to others, I liked to get together again in this dialogical dimension. It's a beautiful thing. It means that something stayed inside that became, but they discovered that it's true, that a certain competence was acquired. There's a last question. Thank you. As an ex-student, I can say how true it was. And I give the microphone to Irene for the last question. So the question that comes from Valentina, as an educator, as those who work in the educational processes, what criteria and methods are important when groups, interdisciplinary groups are formed and intercultural groups are formed? Through dialogue, they try to generate processes for significant learning in children and young people, considering their originality, their process of development, and their culture, and at the same time, educating them towards a guiding role in the positive impact on the society in which they are. I don't know if Sylvia still hasn't spoken, wants to intervene on this. This question is difficult. I have to say that I think, because it's very interesting, I think that on one hand, we are the ones who, educators who probably put ourselves on our tiptoes, because we have a formation, I think, above all on a generational level, which is not interdisciplinary. It's not, in fact. And we continue also not only in our formation, which is what we've received, but also, let's say, in professionals. I'm an academic, and therefore most of academics, they don't have interdisciplinary paths. Absolutely, surely not in Italy, but also in Europe, it's very little. And abroad, there are some places. And Sophia is kind of unique in this respect. For several years, let's say, it has this path, and there's still a long ways to go. But under this aspect, I have to say this, that in my opinion, instead, we have a possibility that of really learning instead. Surely, I'm seeing it in the young people who pose this question to us. Also, the complexity of the world, the pandemic, ecology, they're all interdisciplinary questions, which we adults, we know how to face them in a transversal way, only up to a certain point. That's a very interesting thing. So in a moment in which we put ourselves all together in intergenerational terms, and therefore also with a certain humility, also of wanting to begin to walk together, then we can create something new. This is a bit also an experience which we say, which every day we have. Thank you, Sylvia. I don't know if any others, and this last question, if there are others, otherwise I would give the word. I thank you us very much for all those who've intervened until now, but since we also find ourselves at the last webinar of this journey of ours, we'll let Professor Beppe Milan conclude, who already intervened, but I'll introduce him for a moment. He's an ordinary professor. He studies at the University of Padua, where he was a teacher of education in the Department of Science of Education. He's teaching a master's level course in education in Sofia. He's education and communion, educator in the culture of peace. In addition, he teaches a philosophy education introduction to education at the University of Trent. So they'll give you the microphone, Professor Milan. Thank you, but only 2 words, precisely to conclude and to greet one another. precisely in the fullness of the pandemic, so subjected to this difficulty, this emergency, we as Sophia in particular, as a master's level course in education of communion for a culture of peace, the master's level course called precisely culture of unity. So there's this direction I've taken now. We thought of anyways of being present in this period. And so we had projected these 5 moments of encounter, these 5 webinars that we're able to do. And I would like now to go through them with you. And the first, it was in February, and then every month there was one. The time is short. I wanted to say that every time, I think it was a common experience, we learned something new. Day itself, listening to Sylvia, listening to Mario, listening to Chiara, I feel that I've learned something new because there is this dimension of co-participation, of standpoints, interpretive angles, different languages, personal histories, studies that are different, that every time lead to a well. And this is how it was with this journey, in which there were demanding topics. I don't name all the professors, but very demanding. But at the end, I can say thank you. Thanks for what we've all received. And allow me to begin to say thank you, however, because in this moment, it seems to me the word is thanks. Thanks to those students, guys and girls, those doctoral students or former students of Sophia, who were the soul, in my opinion, of this encounter, who are there, but they're hidden. And they have really sustained and supported the overall project that we've pulled off in these months. I can't name them one by one, but they are there, and I know that they know they're there, and I would like to thank each one of them our thing. And then there are the translators who are often hidden, who are there in this moment with the stress of having to in some way follow our uncontrollable speed. And they are there, and thank you to each one of them. And then the Secretariat of Sophia. There are people who are hidden, who are, however, are essential. They make it possible what we have done and we're doing. So thanks to them. And then the teachers, some of whom are present here, the others, who I don't name, but each of them brought this contribution. I would like to thank on behalf of everyone, precisely our rector, Professor Giuseppe Argiola, and I thank him on everyone's behalf. Sylvia was saying a short while ago, there's something unique to Sophia, and there's a long way to go, and we agree. And I liked the word humility that you used, but which many of us, I think, have used. It seems almost the first strategy. Humility and curiosity together with they help us to be scholars, researchers. We're continuing this beautiful, complex game of education. So this unique dimension with which there is, and there's always more to do, we'll give all of you who are listening, the appointment soon. So we don't know when the next program will be. We will project it together. In the light also of these contributions, which have multiplied as time went on, because our little initial group, we could say, has drawn a lot of interest and a lot of participation by others. So we will relaunch a project which is naturally a Sophia, which has its location and which allows an encounter, physical encounter, a real concrete encounter, but not much less real, not much less concrete, in my opinion, the encounter which there can also be through these tools. The fact that we communicate through the tools of the new technology. I feel that the proximity, the word reciprocal listening is not so much inhibited. If there is this effort to listen and encounter with the other. So we will present some events of encounter, but evidently they broaden the room, physical room, which is at Sophia, which is located there. And we will propose them again on a wider range and presenting experiences like this webinar that we've lived together in these months. So thanks again. And I relaunch the possibility, the hope, but also the certainty that we will see one another soon, widening our and enlarging our co-participation. So thank you. I greet all of you on behalf of Sophia, of all of Sophia. Thank you then. So we too say, we renew this thanks that we feel deeply. And so hear from Sophia. We'll see you soon. The next appointments. Thank you.